I like to start these kinds of conversations with a story. So I'll do that today. Back in 2021, so a year and a half ago or so, my company, Sparkbox, spent almost an entire year consulting with a really large organization. They are in a pretty competitive space. They have, as an organization, they're kind of transitioning into sort of more of a digital first type of company, and they have tons of ideas for new products. But I think they were struggling to move as quickly in executing those new product ideas as they wanted. And so they hired Sparkbox to come and help them do two things. One, to build one of their new product ideas as sort of an MVP, kind of prove out that concept. And alongside that work, they had done a bunch of research and understood that for them to be able to execute quickly moving forward, one idea that could be helpful would be if we also could build a system for them, a design system. And so it was sort of this kind of two-pronged effort. We were alongside their team to build a design system, but also to use that system in the building of one of their first kind of new MVP product concepts. And so we jumped in and we were really, really excited about the work. It was the kind of stuff, that's the kind of stuff we just love to do. Get into the weeds, work on these hard problems, find a way to take the solutions we have and bubble those up to a more kind of systematic approach. That's like what my team loves to do. So we were pretty excited. It's a little bit odd, I guess, for me to start a session like this with this kind of story, because as much as I want to sit here today and tell you how incredible that engagement was and pull up all of the examples, I actually have to be honest with you and share that engagement was a real struggle for us. We just really were struggling with it. And after a year of really trying to make that work, we actually had to make a really hard call, which was to walk away from this client. And the reason that we gave them for making a difficult decision like that was cultural incompatibility. So in almost 15 years now of running Sparkbox, and several years before that running another consultancy, this had never happened to me. And so you can imagine at the end of last year, as we had wrapped up that engagement, we had tried to end it well, but we had to walk away. That experience left me just unsettled, I think is maybe the right word. I was struggling to figure out how the heck did we get to that place? And I guess maybe even more importantly, what could I do to keep that from happening again? So at the beginning of this last year, I started down kind of a rabbit hole of research. I was digging into everything I could find around culture inside of organizations. I was talking to anybody who would give me a few minutes, who had some experience and expertise maybe to share. And all of that research led me, I found a whole bunch of stuff, but what happened is I discovered these two kind of what have become for me very instrumental frameworks in understanding culture and applying the lessons of actually the past from researchers from the last couple decades to the work that you and I are trying to do right now in design systems. So that's kind of what I want to share with you today. And the first of those frameworks is actually one that will help us just to have some language to discuss culture. And that's because, honestly, talking about culture is hard. It's a little bit nebulous, it's very... it's sort of a thing that kind of lives out there, and we all maybe have an intuitive understanding of culture, but it's actually difficult to put words to what culture is. So my initial research was all around, I just want to have the language to be able to discuss culture well. So that kind of led me to this first framework, which was developed by a gentleman named Edgar Sheen, a social scientist and a university professor here in the States. And it really just offers a very simple model that we can use to talk about organizational culture. And he said, culture is made up of 3 layers. The first is our basic underlying assumptions. The second is our espoused beliefs. And the third is the artifacts of the culture. Now, let me explain quickly what each of these layers mean. When he said artifacts, he was talking about the things that we see, the visible perks, the benefits, Perhaps it's the ping pong table or the free lunch that your organization offers to its employees. All that stuff that you can observe from inside or even from outside of that culture, that's the artifacts. The espoused beliefs are the things that people actually say about the organization. So the company mission, the vision, the organization's values, that giant slogan that's painted on the wall when you first get off the elevator or whatever it is, email signatures, conversations that are happening in Slack or in Teams or wherever your organization has those conversations. It's all the things that people say. And then finally, the basic underlying assumptions are what the people actually believe. And these are much harder to determine. Usually, these are revealed by the actions that people take in the face of very difficult situations. So as an employee, you experience all of these layers, but you experience them from the top down. So if you would imagine that you're starting a new job, on that very first day, you're going to observe what's happening around you, right? You're going to maybe start to see the things that are happening. And so that's you observing the artifacts. That's that first interaction you might have with the organization's culture. Eventually, you're going to start to build some relationships. You'll have some conversations with folks. You'll get to hear what people say. And that's you experiencing the espoused beliefs, the second layer down. And then at some point, your leaders or your peers, they're going to be faced with a difficult situation. And this is where you'll actually learn what they truly believe. And that will be based on the decisions they make in that difficult time. Now, when these three layers don't line up, we call that a weak culture. So oftentimes, the things that people say and the things that you see are one thing, but what people do, what they believe, and what they choose to do in a difficult situation is different than the things that they say. And that misalignment, you can always feel that tension if that's the situation where you happen to work. And we call that a weak culture. And a lot of times, weak cultures have kind of an excessive number of policies and procedures. And they do that in order to police kind of the behavior of individuals. They're making decisions based on kind of the lowest common denominator of behavior. But when these three layers do align, we call that a really strong culture. And that means the organization itself doesn't actually need to be as explicit in stating the expectations they have for behaviors. And that's because the individuals, the people that make up that company, all want the same things, right? They share in some common values. That alignment can help tremendously in building an organization where people actually trust each other and where people feel like they genuinely belong. Now, I know we're already 15 minutes in here. I haven't even talked about design systems yet. I promise you we're getting there. I really feel that it's important for us to have a common understanding of culture. So this is the definition. This is kind of the model that I want us to use for today's conversation, all right? So that's the first framework that I found. And I think for me, that was instrumental in just understanding culture, I think, in a better way. And there's a second framework that I want to share with you. And this is another one that just helps us map out the types of cultures that are possible inside of an organization. So this second framework, it was developed in the late 90s by two researchers, Kim Cameron and Robert Quinn. And they called it the Competing Values Framework. Now, in this framework, there are four primary types of organizational culture. And they called it the Competing Values Framework because the x-axis and the y-axis are two spectrums of competing values. So along the y-axis, from top to bottom, they span flexible at the top down to focused at the bottom. So an organizational culture that is flexible, that simply means that organization is dynamic and adaptive, right? This is a culture that has a willingness to change as things around them do. And then focused at the bottom of that y-axis, that really just means it's a stable and ordered culture. So these cultures oftentimes have, I would say it's kind of like a confidence that their founding ideals are the way they should continue to operate. So there's less willingness to change. Now, the x-axis in this competing values framework spans on the left from internal orientation to the right, where it's external orientation. Internal orientation just means that the organization makes decisions based on factors that originate inside the company. So perhaps the concerns of their employees would be one factor that they make decisions based on. An organization that's more externally oriented, that means they're going to make decisions that are based on factors that originate outside the company. So perhaps the economy or their competition or something that's happening in their specific market. Now, most organizations, in fact, I think every organization is going to have a little bit of each of these characteristics. But this gives us kind of a nice lens through which we can view our own cultures. So let me kind of break down each of these quadrants very quickly. In that top left, this is where we're joining a really flexible organization with an internal orientation. And we call this a collaborative or clan culture. So here there's definitely concern for long-term development. Things like cohesion, morale, and mutual support are really important here. And the organization wants to do things together. A lot of times, service companies are here because they want to come alongside another organization and serve them in some way. In that bottom left quadrant, we are joining focus with an internal orientation. So this is a control or hierarchy culture, and this is kind of where progress is incremental, right? It's one step at a time. We're going to measure things. There's a lot of respect here for hierarchy. Value is placed on like stability, predictability, and the organization wants to do things right. In my experience so far, a lot of times it's organizations like large financial institutes or higher ed or healthcare, areas like this tend to be more in this bottom left quadrant. Now, I want to pause here because as I remember back to when I was first reading about this model, and I read about collaborate, and everything in that just resonated with me because personally, that's kind of where I live. I'm a collaborative person. I like to work with other folks. But when I started to read about the control culture, I had sort of these negative ideas about this. And in my mind, I think I was subconsciously saying collaborate is right and control is wrong. But I actually want to caution all of us, myself included, from thinking about these quadrants in that way. In other words, the word, collaborate, the word control, those we need to kind of strip our previous understandings of those words away, because really what these are doing is just kind of defining the characteristics of an organization. So it's entirely possible for there to be a very healthy collaborative culture and to be a very healthy controlling culture. It's also possible to have a very unhealthy collaborative culture and a very unhealthy controlling culture. None of these four are good or bad. They're simply different. So try to keep that in mind, especially as we kind of get into the rest of these quadrants, all right? So in the top right, we're joining flexibility with an external orientation. And this is the creative or adhocracy culture. This is where, new ideas can really break through. Flexibility, creativity, disruption, entrepreneurship, those are the kinds of things that are rewarded here. And there's a lot of value here placed on doing things first. So, startup or scale up organizations oftentimes fall kind of in this top right quadrant. And just as a side note, I had to look up what adhocracy means. I had never actually heard that word, but it's literally just the opposite of bureaucracy. So it just means kind of anything goes. And then our bottom right quadrant is the last one here. And this is where we're joining focus with an external orientation. So they call this the compete or competitive culture or a market culture. Definitely concern here for short-term performance. Acquisition tends to be a strategy for growth. Individuals in these cultures are rewarded for doing things fast. So these are companies that oftentimes are in very competitive markets, and they're, you can imagine maybe you work at one where, you're growing, but you're growing by acquiring the competition, right? That's a sign maybe that you're operating in this bottom right quadrant. Now, in my conversations with folks, there's a lot of things that I've heard them say as they're talking about their cultures. So I've tried to just kind of take some notes in those conversations, and I've added those in here. So, I want to read these to you. And as I do, I just want you to kind of imagine, which of these statements sounds like something you could hear your CEO or president or, leadership inside your organization say, okay? So the collaborative culture tends to say something about people first, right? They're always talking about their employees as a focus, Control organizations tend to talk about avoiding risk. So they're making decisions based on things that will, make the opportunity for there to be risk much lower. And then top right creative, these are folks that are talking about this idea of disruption. They want to kind of break the mold, disrupt it all, break into the new, create our own industry, that kind of thing. And then bottom right, competitive, these are folks who could imagine their leadership talking oftentimes about beating the competition. I saw some of this kind of being hinted at by the conversation that's happening there in the chat. So I love that that is going on. What we're talking about so far is one single concept of culture for an entire organization, but that's actually not quite how it works. Culture, it turns out, is formed any place where a consistent group of people interact regularly. So that could be, of course, the organization as a whole, but it can also be a specific product team. It could be a group of folks who are reading a book together and maybe doing lunch once a week. It could be the group of folks who are just knitting over lunch, So all of those places, any place where there's consistent individuals meeting regularly, they're going to form their own subculture inside that larger organizational culture. So that means for you and I, if you're working on a design system, that design system team, that program that you're putting into place to be more systematic with the creation of your digital products, a subculture is going to form around that program. And that's where I think things start to get really interesting. So for the last year and a half or so, I've been interviewing design system leaders, and I've been talking to them very specifically about these things. And what I've learned is that almost every one of them, not 100%, but darn close to 100% of the folks that I've spoken with, would identify the subculture of their design system program as living on the left side of this diagram, right? That's the side that represents internal orientation, which means that design systems teams are making decisions based on things happening inside the org. That makes sense, right? Because oftentimes they are intended to be an internal tool. So with that knowledge, what that means is that most design system subcultures are either collaborative or controlling. So that first one, collaborative, it falls in again to that top left quadrant. So we know they value doing things together. You can tell that because collaborative, but they're also focused on the long-term success and of the system and the organization. I hear those folks say things kind of like this. I believe the scope of my work cannot be accomplished in any way other than to partner with teams who have caught the vision. Okay, so if you feel that kind of as something that you believe, that might be a sign that you're kind of leaning your systems team, your program around a systematic design is moving into that top left quadrant, right? And I think it's cool because this mentality sort of that kind of cross-team collaboration, that means the systems these folks build tend to be very enabling systems instead of restrictive systems. Now, the other primary type of design system subculture is in the bottom left, or the control quadrant. So we know they value doing things right, and they're focused on those incremental improvements over time. A lot of times, these teams are driven by inconsistency in the products. So I hear them say things kind of like this. My product teams, or feature teams, or however you structure your stuff, my product teams haven't created consistency in our products. So I'm here to make sure that they do going forward, right? Very different perspective. And these teams have a tendency to create systems that are a lot more restrictive instead of enabling, right? Or flexible. So again, remember, neither of these is right or wrong, but there are definitely healthy and unhealthy versions of each. So let's explore that concept a little bit more. What's really important for us to take away here, I think, is that the spectrum between these two cultural types is what helps us identify the healthy and unhealthy behaviors. And it's really the extreme ends of the spectrum, which is where the unhealthy behaviors exist. So let me explain this by having us kind of look at a handful of design system characteristics, and I'll kind of lay them out in this spectrum for you. And I think that'll help you kind of see how this works. So the first one we'll start with is prioritization. So what I mean by that is, how does your design system team make decisions about what to prioritize going into the system? So you got a long list of things that need done that probably should be in the system, or changes or fixes or whatever. How do you decide what happens next? Well, in a healthy collaborative culture, oftentimes those design system teams will prioritize primarily based on the needs of their subscribers. Subscribers just meaning the people who use the design system. So that model is, we're going to get to know those folks, we're going to work with them, we're going to understand their needs, and we'll prioritize the stuff that's going into the system based on the things they need. That makes sense, right? A healthy controlling design system culture is going to prioritize primarily based on the needs of the organization, right? So this is where they're saying it's a little bit more top down. They're saying, hey, we're trying to kind of rein things in a little bit. So instead of trying to understand what all of those product teams need, we're going to look at that stuff and make a decision about the best way to move forward. And we're going to ask those subscribers or users to kind of come more closer to us, to the way the organization needs. That's kind of the two sort of healthy extremes. Now, if we push these things outside of the healthy boundaries, then we get into these unhealthy areas. So an unhealthy collaborative culture might try to prioritize everybody's needs, right? And in doing so, you probably know this, you're going to serve nobody well, okay? And the same thing on the extreme unhealthy controlling culture, where we're basically just ignoring input from subscribers or the system users. And again, that's going to serve nobody well, right? We have to do some of that understanding. So this is one way that you can kind of lay out a characteristic of a design system along the spectrum and see, oh, there are actually a couple, there's like a spectrum of healthy ways to operate, and there are sort of these extreme unhealthy ways. So let's take a look at another characteristic. Let's talk about adoption. So what I mean by that is, what is the driver of adoption in your design system team? So let's take a look at a healthy collaborative culture. Oftentimes, these cultures are driving adoption by relationship. And what I mean by that is they are spending time with subscribers. They're getting to know these folks. They're actually building relationships with these users, these product teams or feature teams that they hope will use the system. And that relationship is kind of core to them choosing, the subscribers choosing to use the system. On the other end of that, the healthy control approach is primarily driven by incentive. So in that model, a lot of times it's the design system team is working with leadership across the product organization to say, if we're going to do this, let's do it right. Let's get at the high levels. Let's get an understanding that for folks to be successful as a product designer, developer, UX, research, tester, all those things, they have to use the system. And that becomes a goal for those individuals to use the system. So two sort of ends of a healthy spectrum, collaborative to control. Now, if we push these outside of that healthy boundary, we get what I call an unsustainable over support through the adoption process on the collaborative side. And what I mean by that is that every interaction you're having with your subscribers is actually kind of training them how you expect the relationship to go. So I see a lot of teams do this where they come alongside, they're trying to be collaborative, they're trying to be relational. They get to know a subscriber team, and maybe they learn that team doesn't have time to do the work to integrate a feature of the system into their product. So they say, you know what, we'll do it for you. And they actually, this is that unsustainable over support. They do it for them. And what they're doing in that model is showing that team, if you're too busy, we'll do it for you, right? They're training them in a way that's actually not healthy. It's not sustainable. You know, the design system team, there's no way, if you're on a systems team, you know this, you can't possibly do that for every product team, for every feature team. So that's not sustainable. So it's sort of more like, let us come alongside you and we'll definitely work with you, especially in the first few times, but you have a responsibility in this relationship too. So I think that's kind of the difference there. And then you can imagine on the other extreme end, an unhealthy control is where there's unsustainable non-support through the adoption process. In other words, the design system team builds the thing and then they're like, all right, figure out how to use it, right? Of course, that's not sustainable either. So somewhere inside of those unhealthy perspectives is a very healthy range of ways that you can choose to work with different parts of the organization. One quick story too, because in the interviews I've done, I've heard so many fun and creative ways that folks have found to kind of, especially around adoption, to really drive adoption. I was speaking with one gentleman who was the design system lead, and I think they only had maybe two other people on the team. It was a very small team, but he was struggling. He got design and UX and research very interested in the system, but could not get his engineering folks on the product side to really even have an interest in using the system. So he started just kind of, he like joined some of their Slack channels and didn't really say much, but was just kind of like watching the conversations in there, kind of seeing the way they interacted with each other. And he picked up on a thread that was a lot of these engineers really wanted to work on open source projects. And so it kind of like after a little bit of time of seeing that repeated, he went to his boss and said, hey, you know, how would you feel about us open sourcing the design system? And she looked around, talked to the legal group, and decided it was actually okay. There was a little bit of work they had to do to kind of anonymize a few things, but they went through that process in a matter of a couple of weeks, open sourced the design system. And then in a matter of a month or so, he had this design system lead had started to see all the engineering groups find some interest, you know, in working on the system because it was open source. And that was something that they had decided was one of their individual goals. So when we talk about incentive, when we talk about relationship, it's not always exactly the way we imagine it, right? It's not always going to the boss and getting new OKRs or KPIs or whatever system you use. Sometimes it's just understanding like that basic, like what do these people want to do, you know, and making some adjustments on the system to help drive adoption in a healthy way. So just anecdotal, but a cool story. Let's keep moving here. So let's talk about extension. So this is when I say extension, I just mean, you know, of course your design system's not going to be perfect for everybody, right? Every use case, it's impossible, right? So in those moments where a subscriber is trying to use the system to do something, but it's not actually meeting the need perfectly, what is it that they do? How do you know, what is your sort of design systems perspective on how they should approach that? Should they modify it? Should they extend the system in some way, or should they like have to work within the confines of the system? So that's what I mean by extension. So let's take a look. Healthy collaborative. I call this intentional flexibility. And that means that there's an extension of the system is actually encouraged. And of course, for that to be done well, you have to define sort of the constraints within which that happens, the process through which they go, right? But that intentional flexibility means the system is there to enable those product teams to extend in some way when that's needed. On the healthy control side, I call it necessarily restrictive. So this is where it's just discouraged. You know, we might say, hey, I understand that you have this kind of specific need, but is there any way can you adjust what you need to do for the product to more closely align with the way that we're suggesting we do these kinds of things in the system, right? So neither of those is black and white, and it's really about encouraging or discouraging. But I think you could probably fill in the extreme unhealthy versions of this now. So Unhealthy collaborative in terms of extension means there's extreme flexibility. In other words, those product teams are overusing the idea of extension. They're modifying everything. And in that world, everything becomes unique and custom. And all of a sudden, you're not dealing with a system anymore, right? You're not thinking systematically. And on the other end, extreme restriction. So this is where extension of the system is just forbidden. So again, a very simple concept, but you can see how there's a healthy range here. And then as you push those to the extreme, you get these behaviors that are really unhealthy. And our last one would just be change management. And I just mean by this that, we're recognizing when you're building a system and asking folks to use it, you're kind of asking everybody to change the way they work. So how do you navigate that change, right? In a healthy collaborative model, the system team is primarily adapting to the workflows of the subscribers. They're trying to make the change that's required from their users as low as possible, right? Lowering the bar for entry here. And on the healthy control side, the subscribers are expected more to adapt to the approach of the system. Okay, so kind of high level, but when we push these, to the extremes, we see on the unhealthy collaborative side, a real extreme accommodation for subscriber workflows. This kind of leaves you with decision paralysis. It's hard to figure out what you should be doing because there are so many ways that you're trying to support, And then on the unhealthy control, a lack of accommodation for subscriber workflows. A lot of times that just means they haven't taken any of the needs of the subscribers into account here. So they end up reworking things, Now, I put all of these on one screen for you. Again, we'll share a video of this later, but if you just want to have that little section of content around healthy, unhealthy, you can feel free to take a screenshot of this. I'll give you just a moment to do so. And we will continue on here. So the competing values framework really is helpful because it gives us an overview of the kinds of organizational cultures that we can expect to see in our workplaces. And we know, I'm feeling fairly confident that most of the design system teams fall on the left side of this chart. So with that in mind, another thing that's super interesting that these two researchers discovered is that some of these cultures are actually very incompatible. So the way that works is that cultures which are diagonal from each other are the ones that are like oil and water. They just don't work well together. So here, let me give you an example. If your organization, so that the organization as a whole, has a creative or entrepreneurial do things first kind of culture, so you're up in this top right create culture primarily, then it's going to be really hard for you to succeed as a controlling do things right design system culture. Okay, this creative culture in the top right, the organization here in this example is all about disrupting things, but the control subculture here is based on the idea that we know the right way to do something. So the idea that one is disrupting and one is saying no, don't disrupt, use it the way we're saying, those two ideas just don't blend well, right? I actually have kind of a fun story here too. I'll tell you just sort of quickly. I was doing an interview with a woman who, in a previous role, led the design system team for a very large web-based product. Many of you have probably used it. And she told me this story. She said that when she began there, the company was in startup mode. They recognized their product interfaces were very inconsistent. So they felt that perhaps a design system was needed in order to get those inconsistencies in the product under control. So the system they built with that context was very limiting. It was definitely an intentionally limiting system. They wanted to really kind of to force the product teams to use the same components and felt that those teams would be able to do what they needed with little or no modification or extension of the system in any way. So it turned out, after trying this, it turned out that the startup mindset of the org, so that's that top right culture, that meant they were constantly pivoting their direction in search of a niche, right? They were trying to figure out what is our fit in the market. So those pivots that the product those pivots in the product were actually the reason for the inconsistency in the interfaces. And when they offered a system to those product teams that was limiting and controlling, it really didn't give them the flexibility they needed to respond to the pivots coming from their leadership. So those teams had to execute on what their leaders were telling them. So they just worked outside the system. Nobody used it. You know, it was a frustrating experience for her. And at the end of the interview, here's what she said to me. This is her quote. She said, "We should have recognized the need for flexibility in the system as a way of supporting the necessary pivots our company was taking in order to find our place in the market. That would have built trust with our subscribers as an enabling tool instead of a restrictive one." So when I heard this story in my brain, you know, after having done all of this reading and research, what she was describing to me without even knowing it was that they should have been more intentional in creating a collaborative design systems subculture. They should have been operating in the top left of this graph. And these two cultures are actually quite compatible. Now, the opposite diagonal is incompatible as well. So if your company is a competitive, you know, do things fast kind of culture, it's really hard for your design system program to succeed if you're trying to do so as a collaborative, do things together kind of culture, right? That bottom right quadrant is about speed, and collaboration slows you down. That's just the truth, right? If you have to stop and try to build consensus all the time, that slows you down. So these two, there's an incompatibility within these two cultures. So in fact, if you recall that story that I told you at the very beginning, where, you know, we chose to kind of walk away from an organization we were working with because of cultural incompatibility, I actually think this is kind of what was happening for us. Our client was in that bottom right quadrant. They were in a very competitive space. And I think, you know, because of my preference and my business partner's preference towards collaboration, we've built Sparkbox to be very collaborative. By default, that's kind of how we operate. And we were trying to operate collaboratively with a client that was not wired for that. They were in that competitive space. So my takeaway from that is that we as an organization have to recognize when we're working with more competitive cultures, and we have to make adjustments to how we work in order to better align with the things they need from us. And these two cultures are compatible, right? And this, you know, this sort of recognition, I think, is what allows you to start to kind of shape the culture of your design system program to better fit inside the culture of your organization. And when you do that, it feels like you're swimming with the current and not against it. So if I was going to give you kind of a big takeaway from this section, I would say it's really about looking up from the work. You know, look around, understand that these cultural forces are at play. And you can try to fight against this reality, but it's pretty hard. It's kind of exhausting. And many times you're just going to be frustrated, you know. Understanding the cultures and the subcultures in your organization is a necessary part of this work. I would say use that understanding to be intentional about forming your own cultures in a way that gives them a chance at success. Anytime that I share about this stuff, I get this question. Folks want to know, can the design system subculture create change in the organization's culture? So kind of like pushing culture up from the bottom. And I want this to be true so badly. I want this to be something that's easy to do. And I think I definitely can say now that I have seen very healthy design system subcultures make an impact on the design or product subculture of their organizations, for sure. But I'll also say that it's actually really hard work to do that. And it's slow work. It takes a lot of time because you're really trying to shift the entire organization. You know, that's tough stuff. And actually that comes back to this very first diagram. So you'll recall when I explained this, that as employees, we experience culture from the top down. And what's funny about that is that that's how we experience it, but that's not how you create culture. Culture is created from the bottom up. And you do that by identifying the underlying assumptions that are shared by the individuals inside your organization. And those overlapping underlying assumptions become your common values. And when you find unity in those underlying assumptions, the other two layers are just a natural outpouring of those beliefs. With that kind of cultural alignment, the things we say and the things we see are simply a reflection of the things we believe. There's 3 things that I could tell you that you need to do in order to curate a healthy culture. The first one is on you. You have to model it, right? It all starts with your behaviors. You have to behave in a way that communicates the basic underlying assumptions that you expect of your team. The second thing you got to do is meet folks where they are. This is about kind of how you communicate the things you believe, and it's about understanding people learn and communicate in different ways, looking to see kind of where they are, communicating, where they're interacting, and going there and participating with them in the places where they are. And then finally, you have to be consistent. This is not a quick thing. It takes a lot of time. In fact, it can take years. And it definitely requires you to build trust over that time. And that means you have to show time and time again that the things you say align with the things you believe. It's about demonstrating that you have alignment in that pyramid. Now, in practice, you all are living probably in a world kind of like this. This is very simplified, but you have some set of folks who work on the design system. So that's the design system team on the left side of this diagram, the one circle there. And you have some set of folks who work with the design system. So that's subscriber groups or users or whatever you call them. On the right side, I have 3 here as an example. I believe that it's not enough to work only with the design system team to create culture. I think the key to creating cultural shift is to have a very direct impact on both sides of this image. So for us, as a service provider, that means we want to put our design system expertise alongside the people working on the system, but that's not enough to create change. We also have to put expertise alongside the people working with the system. And as those subscriber groups grow, as adoption grows, we have to continue to add expertise there, right? What this does is this gives us the ability to meet those folks where they are. It's only then that we can model the cultural interactions we want to see. And it takes doing that consistently over time to make a real impact. But this is kind of like the sort of secret sauce for us. You know, this is how we are able to help organizations that are really struggling with some of these cultural challenges to create a healthy system with a real impact that will actually last. That's kind of like how this has impacted our practice, you know. And I just want to close with one simple idea, and that is maybe a bit controversial, and that's that your design system will not make your products more consistent. So think about that, right? You and I could take any design system in the world, no matter how inflexible or controlling it is, and we can make the most wildly inconsistent products with it. I guarantee you I could do that. The hard truth here is that people will make what they want to make. And the critical word in that statement is the word want. So if consistency or cohesion is your goal, the only sustainable way to get that is to change what your subscribers want to do. And you do that with culture, not with pixels, not with code or documentation, not with Figma, not with React. And your design system can be a catalyst for that kind of change, but it won't do that on its own. That is the unspoken and deeply challenging mandate of a design system team. That right there is your job. I sincerely hope some of these ideas will help you to do that job just a little bit better tomorrow. And I just want to thank you all so much for your attention and for listening.